Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Explore Spiritism program on Kardec Radio. In this program, I share teachings, resources, and reflections to help you along your way in your exploration of Spiritism. Tonight, we're going to take a look at a couple chapters from a Spiritist book called In the Realms of Mediumship. Is written by the Spirit author Andre Luis through the psychography of the medium Chico Xavier. For those of you who read Andre Luis's book No Solar or saw the movie based on that book, you know that Andre Luis is a spirit who has been able to tell us as readers a lot about spirit life, life in the spirit realm, and the interactions between our two realms of life. So the first book in that series was called No Solar, and this is another book in the series, but it's focused specifically on mediumship. So in all those books, Andre Luis, he takes us with him on these different sort of learning excursions that he gets to go on with his instructors who expose him to all different kinds of situations where we see events happening in the spirit realm, the material realm, or sometimes with the interaction between the two realms. And so in this case, regarding mediumship in particular, we see the Spiritist perspective on the application and use of the mediumistic faculty in the service of others. So we really learn a lot about the technical and moral aspects of the faculty and the responsibility of mediumship. Now, I'm going to share with you some text from chapters 4 and 5. For those who just joined, we're going to read from In the Realms of Mediumship tonight. And as I just mentioned, it's going to be chapter 4 and 5. So I want to give you a little background. Andre Luis is with his instructor, Aulus, who is going to bring him to a Spiritist center where they're holding a meeting for the work of disobsession. If you're not familiar with that, it's a work that is done in a closed mediumistic session for the service of helping to bring relief to spirits, incarnate and discarnate, that are involved in what ends up being a kind of harmful relationship. Because here we're talking about something in Spiritism called obsession. That's kind of a sort of symbiotic relationship between two spirits. It can be between two discarnate spirits, two incarnate spirits, or between an incarnate and discarnate, but where there's a kind of persistent and harmful influence from one spirit on the other, or even between both. And in these kinds of meetings that Spiritists conduct, what they do is they will have most typically an incarnate individual involved with a discarnate spirit, where, like I said, there's this harmful influence. And so they bring education, moral support, enlightenment, different perspectives to both the incarnate and discarnate individual, and help to sort of release them from that kind of attachment. It's also called spirit release therapy by some. So Andre Luis is going to be able to witness this kind of meeting taking place. And just to give you a little background on this instructor of his, Aulus, we do learn a little bit about him in chapter 1. So I'm going to share that with you. Aulus, it says here, he had been interested in mediumistic experiments in 1779 when he had actually known Mesmer in Paris, where he studied the celebrated propositions introduced to the public by this famous magnetizer Mesmer. And then he had reincarnated again at the beginning of the 19th century and had the chance to witness firsthand these different accomplishments of Allan Kardec in the codification of Spiritism. So during that life, he spent several decades dedicated to mediumship and to magnetism in what's referred to here as the scientific molds of Europe. So this instructor, like I said, is taking André Luis to this Spiritist center. And I'm actually going to read to you from these two chapters, 4 and 5, but we're going to stop for some comments along the way, okay? So chapter 4 begins where they are already at the center. They have made some initial observations and gotten some clarifications on the different workers of the Spiritist group, the mediumistic team that are present, and the work is going to begin. And the chapter reads, "A gentle knock on the door caused one of the members of the group to leave the meditation circle and answered it." So the group was already joined together in this communion of thought and meditation to sort of collectively lift their vibration and come together in a union of sentiment and thought. Someone got up to answer the door, and it says, "Two patients, a young woman and an elderly gentleman, brought by two family members, entered and sat in a corner of the room outside the group's magnetic circle. Those are the patients who are to receive assistance," stated Aulis. And soon thereafter, a co-worker from our plane, so André Luis is saying, here in this spiritual dimension, one of the workers in the spirit realm, admitted several suffering and disturbed spirits who then stood before the assembly, forming a large group. So in this kind of meeting that's held for disobsession, what happens is that spiritual mentors bring the discarnate spirits who are in need of this kind of support. They bring them to the group, and then also present there quite often are the incarnate individuals involved in this kind of attachment-like relationship with them. So André goes on. "None of them," referring to those spirits that had arrived, "were ill at ease in approaching us. Instinctively, they had gathered around the praying incarnates like moths instinctively drawn to a bright light. They had arrived noisily, uttering disconnected words or unedifying expressions. However, as soon as they came in contact with the spiritual emanations of the group, they fell silent, as if restrained by forces they could not perceive." So this group, first of all, in the Spiritist Center, because of the work that goes on there, there's already a sort of very harmonious kind of energy in the place. But then this group, through their work and the meditation they had done at the beginning, set a sort of moral, energetic tone for that environment. And so once the arriving spirits came under that influence, they had kind of quieted down. Aulis attentively informed us, referring to those spirits. He said, "Those are disturbed souls who accompany incarnate relatives, friends, or enemies to the center's public meetings. But they disconnect from them as soon as the incarnates let themselves be renewed by the salvific ideas expressed by those who provide the doctrinal teachings. Once the minds of those whom they habitually vampirize are changed," and the word vampirize refers to that kind of just very close attachment where in some cases the disturbing spirit will actually feed off of the mental emanations or energetic vibrations or sensations of the incarnate individual. So that's why it's described that way. But he says, they feel like they have been evicted from their home because as the train of thought of those to whom they attach themselves is changed, they experience sudden turns in the positions they are wrongly holding. So once the incarnate individual becomes renewed in their own ideas and thoughts and efforts, it changes that sort of mental space that the spirit was inhabiting, and they feel this kind of sense of eviction. Some rebel and flee from places of prayer such as this one, temporarily hating its assistance and arming new persecutions for their victims, whom they go looking for until they find them again. Others, however, are somewhat touched by the lessons they hear and remain on the premises in eager expectation, hungry for further enlightenment. So the spirits will join the incarnates in not only kind of public meetings at the center where they become exposed to enlightened and morally uplifting ideas, but also in these specific meetings for what they call disobsession, there is a counselor, an incarnate being, an incarnate person who will speak to the disturbed spirit through a medium, offering new perspectives, offering moral counseling and support. And a lot of the spirits in this way over time, it doesn't happen in just one session, but through a series of sessions, end up finding relief. So Andre goes on. Ilario received this information. Oh, Ilario is a friend who is also accompanying Andre Luis in this learning excursion. He says, Ilario received this information with surprise and asked curiously, what happens when the incarnates pay no attention to the lessons? They attend sanctuaries of faith like sealed vessels, impervious to good suggestions. They continue to be inaccessible to the change they need so much. That's what Aulus replied. So Hilarius asks, is this same phenomena repeated in temples of other religious faiths? Yes. The spoken word plays a significant role in the building of the spirit. As long as they are inspired by the infinite good, sermons and lectures by clergy and religious instructors of different faiths have moral growth as their objective. So it doesn't matter, what kind of religion or what kind of specific context the moral instruction is coming from, as long as it is for the good and of a sound moral nature, then the influence that it has will be a positive one. The assistant thought for a moment and added, however, while it's hard for people to cultivate a worthy life, it's even harder for them to get ready for a liberating death. The soul usually discarnates without having rid itself of thoughts that are entangled in situations, persons, and earthly matters. Consequently, the mind continues to be imprisoned by the nearly always inferior interests of the world. It remains crystallized and sickly within disquieting scenes it has created for itself. Hence the value of proper religious worship, because it creates an environment suitable for spiritual growth and has indispensable advantages not only for incarnates who sincerely and fervently participate in it, but also for discarnates who aspire to their own transformation. During public worship, all sanctuaries are filled with needy souls who attend without their dense bodies, meaning the discarnate spirits who accompany the incarnates, thirsting for relief. Proclaimers of the good word can be compared to electricians, disconnecting mental plugs through the liberating principles they spread in the sphere of thought. And that's that analogy of mental plugs is really interesting, because it is exactly what we do. Through the regular focus of our own thoughts, we sort of plug ourselves in to other sources of mental currents within the psychosphere that we are immersed in. And so when one is looking for relief from a harmful spiritual influence, we need to sort of plug ourselves in to something that is a more positive influence. And we do this by refocusing our thoughts and our mental habits on uplifting material and activities and sources of information. Andre goes on. He, referring to Aulus, smiled amiably and continued, "That is why vampirizing spirits work against such speakers, quite often enveloping their listeners in soporific fluids that make them sleepy in order to delay their renewal." As I observed the troubled spirits gathered by the table in a semicircle, I thought about using the psychoscope to examine them more closely. Aulus, however, immediately told me. I want to interject here for a moment to explain what this word psychoscope referred to. So we're all familiar with the telescope, the microscope, the stethoscope, all kinds of instruments used to look deeper into something that we can't otherwise see with the naked eye. So Andre Luis is revealing here an instrument that science really hasn't gotten to explore, but it's called a psychoscope. In an earlier chapter, it was described because when they were getting ready to leave to head over to the Spiritist Center, they noticed Aulus picking up this kind of box, and Andre Luis and Hilario asked about it. So Aulus explained, "This is a psychoscope. It will facilitate our examinations and studies without the need for intense mental concentration." Andre Luis said, "I picked up the enigmatic instrument as I accepted the pleasure of carrying it. I could tell that on Earth the tiny object would have weighed no more than a few grams. Pricked by curiosity as much as I was, Hilario immediately asked, 'A psychoscope? What kind of contraption is that?' And so Aulus explained to them, it's an apparatus that an illustrious student of spirit phenomenology intuitively referred to at the end of the last century. It's designed to probe the soul. It has the power to define the soul's vibrations and the ability to make diverse observations regarding the subject," Aulus explained with a smile. "We hope that in the future it will be available to human beings. It runs on electricity and magnetism, utilizing radiant elements similar in essence to gamma rays. It is composed of lenses for observation that can also be used for microphotography." So when Andre Luis mentioned wanting to use it, actually in this particular moment at the meeting that he was observing, Aulus explained that for now it would not be necessary. He says, "That won't be necessary. A careful analysis will suffice to provide us with interesting results since our friends display their sufferings on their peri-spiritual bodies." I noticed that Assistant Aulus did not want to prolong the conversation, probably because he was preparing to take part in the forthcoming work. Thus, I took advantage of those brief moments to observe the unfortunate discarnates bound closely together amid anguish and expectancy. They appeared to be enveloped in a large oval cloud, like a thick, moving dark gray fog, agitated by strange formations. I observed the whole group and noticed that some displayed infirmities as if they were still in the flesh. Wounded limbs, deformities, paralyses, and various ulcerations were perceptible at a quick glance. Perhaps because Ilario and I were examining them closely like students in a classroom, one of the meeting's spirit participants, meaning a discarnate spirit there along with them, approached us and cordially explained, "These suffering brothers and sisters all bear the stigma of the wrongs they deliberately committed. Infirmities that are the result of moral imbalance survive in the perispirit, nourished by the thoughts that originate them, when such thoughts persist after the death of the corporeal body." "But do they show improvement at mediumistic meetings?" asked Ilario, astonished. "Yes," he responded. "They assimilate new ideas and start to use them, albeit slowly, thereby improving their inner vision and structuring new destinies. Mental renewal is the renewal of life." And then Andre Luis says, "I thought about the illusion of those who see death as being the soul's free ticket to heaven or hell as final places of happiness or sorrow. How few are those who are aware that we bring with us the marks of our thoughts, activities, and accomplishments, and that the grave is nothing more than the photographic developer bath for the images we hid in the world under the garment of flesh." This analogy to photography fits especially for those of us who remember before the age of digital photographs, right? When we take our film to actually be developed, right? And it had to be put in this bath of chemicals to actually develop the photographs in print. But it's very true that when we are in the flesh, we are able to sort of keep our thoughts, to the most degree, at least to the majority of others incarnate, hidden, right? But once we are free from the material physical body, our thoughts become more exposed, just like the images held on the film that gets developed into photographs. And so Andre continues his thoughts. "Consciousness is a center of forces around which the good and evil generated by consciousness itself gravitate. And right there we had come face to face with a vast rank of souls suffering in the different purgatories characteristic of them. We approached a sad discarnate who wore an emaciated expression, and Ilario, on a purely human impulse, asked him, 'Friend, what is your name?' 'My name?' he stammered. After a huge but futile effort to remember, he answered, 'I don't have a name.' 'Impossible,' replied an astonished Ilario. 'We all have names.' I've forgotten everything,' responded the wretched despondently. 'This is a case of amnesia that needs to be studied,' clarified a member from the work team we were visiting. 'Is this a natural phenomena?' asked Ilario, perplexed. 'Yes, it may be natural due to some kind of imbalance brought from Earth, but it's possible that our friend is being victimized by a powerful post-hypnotic suggestion that may have originated with a persecutor that had great power over his mnemonic resources. Our friend is still profoundly attached to physical sensations, and his mental life is still a copy of the sensorial forms he left behind. Seen from this point of view, he is probably under control of foreign and contemptible wills with which he may have been associated while on Earth." So there's two important points I want to make about what this spirit had just clarified. You know, of course, it illustrates how death is not a great transformer in and of itself in terms of who we are at the core of our being at the moment of passing from one state to another. We remain the same, and we carry with us the kind of thoughts and emotions that we had before. If we remain mentally fixated in those same thoughts, then we stay in the same emotional state. And this spirit, what it's saying here, is likely remains tied, mentally speaking, to someone still on earth with whom he had associated while still incarnate. And so the other important point here, or thing that we can take it from it, is a reminder that as we learn in Spiritist books, like the Medium's book, an obsession doesn't have to be from, if it's between an incarnate and discarnate, it doesn't have to be that the obsessing spirit or one generating the disturbance it doesn't mean that it's this discarnate spirit. It can also be the projection or emanation of disturbing, harmful thoughts, vibrations from an incarnate being to a discarnate being. And so Ilario responded, "Good God, is such control after death possible? And why not? Death is merely the continuation of life. And in life, which is eternal, we get what we ask for." Attentive to our studies on mediumship, I remarked, if our amnesiac friend were taken to a medium, would he communicate like this, not knowing his own destiny? Absolutely. He would require a caring treatment like any ordinary mental case. We could say like a mental health case. Speaking through any medium that might grant him access, he would display for any earthly counselor the same enigma that we are now witnessing. At that moment, a spirit in a deplorable state came near us. He was a thin, sad man, and his right arm was paralyzed and withered. Responding to my questioning glance and appearing to have little time to spare in fraternal conversation, our colleague only said, "Examine him and draw your own conclusions." I gently touched his forehead and sensed his anguish. In the crystallized memories of his mental world, I perceived his inner drama. He had been a well-muscled stevedore on the docks, a die-hard drunkard who returned home one day and slapped his father's face because the old man disapproved of his conduct. So you can imagine this younger man arrives home and the father picked this day to confront him, to confront his son about his behavior, and the response was not a good one. Unable to return the attack, the old man, spitting blood, shouted mercilessly, "You bastard, may your cruel arm turn into a dry stick, may you be damned." Upon hearing those words, which were accompanied by a terrifying stream of hypnotic power, the son went back out on the street. Distraught by the curse hurled at him, he got drunk in order to forget. As he staggered around, he got hit by a streetcar and lost his arm. Again, remember, this is all the memory of this spirit that Andre Luis is being able to read from his mental field. He lived for a few more years, but during that time, he crystallized in his mind the idea that his father's words had had the power of a vengeful command and had become implanted in the depths of his soul. Thus, upon discarnating, his perispiritual body recovered his formerly severed limb, but due to his fixed idea, it hung withered and inert. Andre Luis then says or writes, "As I was reflecting on all this, our mentor approached, and perceiving what was happening, he informed us, 'This is a very difficult case of readjustment, requiring time and tolerance.' And placing his hand on the shoulders of the paralytic, he added, 'Our friend's mind is subjugated by remorse. He harbors within himself the curse he received. He will require a lot of loving care to recover.' Without digressing from the subject, I inquired, if he were to utilize a medium to communicate, would he transmit to the human receptor the sensation he now harbors? In other words, under the voluntary influence of that spirit, in order to allow the spirit to communicate, would the medium feel the sensation, the physical-like sensations that spirit feels. And the assistant confirmed, yes, the spirit would reflect in the passive medium the impressions that have taken him over, according to the magnetizing process in which the services of interchange are based. The services of interchange, meaning the employment of mediumship. However, let's not lose our focus in individual cases for now. Each of the imbalanced spirits here has brought his or her own disquieting experience. Let's observe this from a higher viewpoint. He then led me to the head of the table. Our friend Raul Silva was about to say a prayer. So again, this is only the beginning of the book, and it is at the point where Andre Luis, Hilario, and their instructor Aulas had just recently arrived to the meeting, and they first observed the mediumistic workers from the Spiritist group, the workers also who collaborate from the spirit realm, and then they began to observe some of the arriving discarnate spirits. And then those observations and that last comment lead us into the next chapter that I'm going to share. And this chapter's chapter 5, it's called The Assimilation of Mental Currents. So let's continue the story. Just 2 minutes before 8 p.m., the spirit director responsible for the meeting entered the small room. Our guide introduced everyone. Brother Clementino greeted us warmly. This place belongs to all of us, he said with a smile, inviting us to feel at ease in carrying out the task entrusted to us. At that moment, various spirits from our plane approached the mediums who would participate in that evening's work. Clementino moved to Raul Silva's side, where he stood in silent reflection. Soon thereafter, Aulas, who was Andre's instructor, Aulas invited me to look through the psychoscope. Remember, I explained that a little earlier. Adjusting it to a different modality, he recommended a careful examination. I focused on the mediums immersed in a mental concentration and saw them in a different aspect. This time, their physical bodies were like high-tension electromagnetic currents. The nervous system, the glands, and the various plexuses emitted a particular luminescence. Juxtaposed on the brain, the mind appeared as a sphere of distinctive light, each person with his or her particular radiation potential. Acknowledging our curiosity, the assistant explained. So the assistant was seeing that, Andre and Hilario were very curious about this whole effect, not only in the spiritual body of the mediums, but also how this was reflecting in the physical body as well. And the assistant explained, in any mediumistic study, we mustn't forget that while in the flesh, the spiritual individuality resides in the atomic citadel of the physical body, formed by resources taken on loan from the Earth's environment. Blood, brain, nerves, bone, skin, and muscles represent elements agglutinated for the temporary manifestation of the soul on Earth, constituting its temporary garment according to the conditions of the mind. At that instant, Brother Clementino placed his hand on Raul's forehead, while his figure from our standpoint became more human-like, almost opaque. Our spirit benefactor and director, explained Aulas, appears denser because he has lowered his normally elevated vibration to match Raul's vibratory level as far as possible in order to begin the task at hand. Okay, so you have the medium, Raul, and you have the spiritual benefactor. They are, even though they are both there with very noble intentions and are in tune in terms of being elevated in the character of their thought and their will, the spiritual benefactor is of a much higher vibration. And so in order to really concentrate and improve or solidify that attunement with the medium, the spiritual benefactor adjusts his own vibratory level. So Aulus goes on to explain, he is now acting upon Raoul's brain somewhat like an emeritus musician would respectfully handle a highly valuable violin, whose firmness and harmony he recognizes. We noticed that Clementino's venerable hand had begun to emit flashes of light. At the same time, Raoul's brain, under the influence of the benefactor's hand, acquired an intense luminosity, albeit of a different kind. The discarnate mentor lifted up his moving voice, asking for the divine blessing with words familiar to us. Raoul transmitted them in a loud voice with very little variation. So here André Luis is actually getting to witness the two realms, right? So he's seeing the spiritual benefactor deliver the message in the spirit realm, and the medium, Raoul, being able to, as the medium, transmit that message, which could then be heard by all the workers present. An emotion took hold of our hearts. A gentle silence ensued for a few quick moments. Threads of shining light connected the participants at the table, and we saw that the prayer had brought them together more completely. So that was the purpose of having this kind of opening. They're going to move on to being able to receive the suffering spirits, but first they want to really prepare the environment and the mental and energetic capacities for protection of all of those workers present. The prayer over, I approached Raoul, right? So André is approaching Raoul. He says, I wanted to investigate more deeply the sensations that had come over his physical body. I noticed that his upper torso, including his arms and hands, were enveloped by a vigorous wave of energy that caused goosebumps upon his skin, a phenomena of gentle exultation similar to a pleasant shiver. This wave of energy came to rest on his solar plexus, where it became a luminous stimulus that spread through the nervous system to the brain and then flowed from his mouth in the form of words. Following my analysis, the assistant explained, Brother Clementino's stream of mental forces has acted upon Raoul's psychic organization like a current sent to an electric bulb. From the solar plexus, right? So these are the energy centers or chakras within the spiritual body of the incarnate medium. He says, from the solar plexus, Clementino's stream of mental forces rose toward the neurocerebral system, similar to the electricity from a power plant, which at reaching the bulb spreads through the incandescent filament to produce light. And what about the voltage problem? I inquired curiously. It hasn't been overlooked. Clementino has gradated his thoughts and expressions according to Raoul's capacity, as well as that of the surrounding environment, adjusting himself according to what they can handle, much like when the electrician controls the flow of energy according to the network of receiver elements. He smiled and added, each participant receives according to his or her own capacity. And that's right there a reflection of the proper education and training and effort and will that is put into the development and practice of the mediumistic faculty. Aulus's comparisons suggested interesting questions. The electrical connection generates the light in a bulb. But what about in this case? From what we could tell, the spiritual contact obviously generated energies flowing from Raoul's brain and mouth in the form of luminous rays and words. The instructor perceived our mute inquiry is kind of illustrating how thoughts are perceived from one discarnate spirit or by one discarnate spirit of the thoughts of another, right? So he says, the instructor perceived our mute inquiry and hastened to explain. The bulb within which the light is produced, using this as an analogy, the bulb emits photons, which are the living elements of nature vibrating in physical space through movements particular to them. Likewise, our soul, within which the radiating idea is processed, emits the spiritual elements condensed in the multiple and ponderable energy of thought. In turn, we influence the mental space with those elements. Meaning, when he says we, he's referring to we spirits in the discarnate state or in the spirit realm influence the mental space of the medium with those elements that he just explained. Worlds act on one another through the radiating energies they emit, and souls influence one another through the mental agents they produce. Our mentor's precise and serene words compelled us to reflect, albeit briefly. His clear explanations regarding mental energy led me to an invaluable conclusion. Thought cannot escape the realities of the corpuscular world. Just as we on Earth have an understanding of the chemistry of dense matter by cataloging its atomic units, the mental field offers broad opportunities for studying its combinations. Thoughts of cruelty, rebelliousness, sadness, love, comprehension, hope, and joy would thus possess differentiated natures within their own characteristics and weights, rendering the soul more dense or subtle, besides defining its magnetic qualities as well. The mental wave would thus possess specific coefficients of energy, whether in silent concentration, speech, or written words. As you can see, there's a lot to learn about thought and natural law and the more scientific and technical aspects of our spiritual nature. And we really get the opportunity to learn a lot about this in Spiritism, but this is just a good example. André continues, in this way I understood once more and without hindrance that we are naturally victims or beneficiaries of our own creations according to the mental currents that we project. We thereby enslave ourselves to the liabilities of our past or liberate ourselves for the forefront of progress according to our decisions and activities in harmony or disharmony with eternal laws. This soliloquy didn't last long. Our mentor, attentive to the objectives of our presence at the center, asked, "Did you notice the communion between Clementino and Raul during the prayer?" Seeing our expectation as learners, he continued, "We have just seen the phenomena of the perfect assimilation of mental currents that usually preside over nearly all mediumistic phenomena. To clarify, let's compare Raul, our incarnate co-worker, to a receiving apparatus like those used in broadcasting. By condensing his thought and will, Clementino's mental emissions envelop Raul in a profusion of rays that reach his inner field, first through the pores of the skin, which are myriads of antennae upon which the emissions take on the aspect of weak and indistinct impressions." Interesting, right? These impressions connect with the spirit body centers or energy centers, which act like condensers and immediately reach the cables of the nervous system, which in turn perform the role of induction coils. There, impressions accumulate in an instant and then are automatically reconstituted in the brain, where we possess hundreds of motor centers, similar to a miraculous keyboard of electromagnets linked to each other, and in whose dynamic center mental actions and reactions are processed, determining creative vibrations through thought or speech, with the brain acting as a powerful broadcasting and receiving station, and the mouth as a loudspeaker. Such stimuli are also expressed through the mechanisms of the hand and feet, or through the senses and organs which operate in the manner of cranes and conductors, transformers, and analyzers under the direct command of the mind. For those who are more interested in learning about the process of the attunement, the connection between the spirit and the medium, and the different types of mediumship and what they look like and how they work, I highly recommend that you check out Allan Kardec's book, The Medium's Book. But here in this novel, in which the spirit Andre Luis is telling us about his experience, he goes on to say that regarding that explanation they just received, his explanation could not have been simpler. However, it still offered an opportunity for broader questions. So, is this the technique of thought itself? Asked Ilario with great interest. Not exactly, answered the mentor. Thought, which is exclusive to each of us, flows incessantly from our brain like the heat and magnetic waves that are unique to each of us. And we normally use it to activate the resources that we have, right? So thought that originates in the mind, that is of our own spirit, it then flows through, is processed by the brain and flows from it like heat and magnetic waves, right? But there is a difference between our own thoughts and then the thoughts that we pick up on based on spiritual influence. And so Ilario then follows up his question saying, but it's not so easy to tell the difference between our own mental creation and one that comes into our head from others. The assistant then says, your assertion is groundless. Any person who knows how to manage his or her attention can tell the difference, since our thoughts vibrate at a unique frequency that comes across in our specific mode of expression, habits, and points of view, and in the manner and style that are particular to us. If we are vigilant, if we really pay attention to our thoughts, the kind of thoughts that we have, on a regular basis, we start to know ourselves better. We know what comes naturally to us. And we can kind of tell when some thought seems to come out of nowhere or doesn't seem consistent with how we feel or the way that we normally think. We can kind of start to detect when we might be under an outside influence. And so then the assistant added, in matters of this type, we must be very careful in our judgments. While we align our criterion with earthly standards, our mental life is almost always parasitic, since we hide our thought waves in order to reflect and act within established prejudices or the pragmatism of pre-established customs, which are mental crystallizations in time. Or we follow the fashion of the day and the opinions of our friends, all constituting an easy accommodation that requires less effort. But it would be enough to practice meditation, to study constructively, and to get into the habit of discerning in order to understand where our line of thought lies, thus clearly identifying the spiritual currents that we are assimilating. And so that was what I was just referring to. Andre says, Ilario thought for a few moments, and showing on his face the satisfaction of someone who's made an important discovery, right? Ilario had an aha moment. He said, quite pleased, now I can see how mediumistic phenomena can occur in the simple situations of life, as well as in noble deeds of excellence and in daily dramas, right? So we hear often in Spiritism this idea that we're all mediums and we're all under spiritual influence. And so here, Eladio and Andre are getting some further explanation on that helps to make it clear for them. Andre continues, yes, our mentor agreed, now concerned about the amount of time our conversation was taking. Mediumship is a gift inherent to all individuals, just like the faculty of breathing, and each person assimilates the higher or lower energies with which he or she is in tune. That is why the Divine Master recommends prayer and vigilance so that we do not fall prey to the suggestions of evil. Temptation is a thread of living forces radiating from us, capturing elements that are similar to it, and thus weaving around our soul a thick web of impulses that sometimes becomes irresistible. And then, taking his place in the ongoing meeting, he added, let's study as we work. The time utilized in serving others is a blessing that we accumulate on our behalf forever. And from there on, in the other chapters, they are going to get into the portion of the meeting where the mediums present are going to receive what we say, like receive the spirits or channel the communication of those spirits, the suffering spirits who are present, in order for them to receive counseling and loving support. And this is an example of the way that mediumistic is used with a noble application among spiritists. It's the kind of vision that spiritists have of mediumship and how it should be practiced. But throughout each of these chapters, not only do you get to see how these kinds of mediums happen and what goes on, but you get to learn a lot about mental life and mental activity, spirit life, the interaction between two realms, and different kinds of mediumistic manifestations. So I just want to, before I close, I want to read the back of this book, a little description of it, because if you thought that was interesting, just a little bit that I read, I highly recommend that you pick up this book and take a read. It's super interesting and quite fascinating. And so the back of the book reads, in this book, André Luis analyzes the various aspects of mediumistic communication, praising the efforts of mediums who are faithful to the spiritual mandate they received before they reincarnated, and warning them about the risks of badly practiced exchanges between the two worlds. The book deals with psychophony, somnambulism, possession, clairvoyance, clairaudience, out-of-body activity, fascination, psychometry, and physical effects mediumship, among other related subjects. It is a technical study of great relevance that reveals how spirits act in the intricate processes of communicating with incarnates. It transmits concepts of highly evolved spirit mentors and expositions of scientific and evangelical content indispensable to those who have dedicated themselves to the study of this subject. And again, that's in the realms of mediumship by spirit author André Luis through the medium Chico Xavier, or Francisco Cândido Xavier, who is affectionately referred to as Chico Xavier. Okay, so that's it for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of discussion of thought, mediumship, and the interaction between two realms of life, in this case for the noble work of mediumship in service to suffering brothers and sisters. I wish you all a great next couple of weeks. And if you have any questions or you would like to send any kind of thoughts you may have to us, you can reach out to us either at Kardec Radio or Explore Spiritism. I thank you so much for your time and attention. Good night and God bless.